go. Well, first, thank you so much, Rebecca, for your comments. With respect to the decor of Chinese restaurants, it's not something that I thought a great deal about. I know that as chop suey became more popular, Chinese entrepreneurs and also other entrepreneurs actually began to open up these restaurants, primarily along 3rd and 6th Avenues. So the Tenderloin was a real magnet for Chinese restaurants during this period. But I do know that Chinese entrepreneurs sought to really cater to visitors' expectations of what a Chinese restaurant might be. And I think that they also sought to really amplify this exotic element through the decor. And restaurants in Chinatown, as well as those uptown, sort of utilize similar decor in terms of the teak furnishings, red and gold lanterns, and things of that nature. And as for your comment about the geography, I mean, that's something that really interested me to begin with when I first started my investigation of Sloan's painting, because I noticed that the Shin included very different clientele, that there were actually Chinese immigrants included within that image. And it was so striking to me that the Sloan painting did not include Chinese immigrants, so that really made me wonder. But I think that the date of that painting, the fact that it's from 1909 and it reflects this movement of Chinese restaurants uptown, as well as the location in the Tenderloin, reflects the fact that Chinese immigrants would not have been among those other patrons eating. So in other words, Chinese immigrants would have really been confined to Chinatown. That's where they did all of their socializing. During this moment, many of them owned Chinese laundries, and that's not because of preference, but it was because of discriminatory reasons that they owned and operated Chinese laundries. And so on their days off on Sunday, they would go to Chinatown and would go to eat. So I think that that omission of Chinese immigrants from Sloan's painting is especially telling, and I think that it really speaks to the mobility of artists like Sloan and Shin, who can really go anywhere in the city, and I think it speaks to the immobility of Chinese immigrants as a result.
Thank you for your comments, Rebecca. And a longer version of this paper, I think about more carefully this issue of class. Part of the way in which what's interested me about the crowd metaphor is, one, its extraordinary pervasiveness for actually a relatively short period of time, as you know. It's really about 1895 to about 1910. That issue, culturally pervasive all over the place. And two, that it erases all sorts of distinctions while actually being subtended by it. So it's this interesting moment in which a kind of conceptual abstraction lines up with a visual abstraction, and what it obscures and what's of course underneath it are class and racial differences. And in kind of a bigger version of it, I do address that more, though it's something I have to think about a bit more. And then with regards to election night, now I wish I'd kept that section of my paper, but okay, we made choices. My view on that is that it is similar in lots of respects. It's a crowd, it has to do with democracy, it's raucous, it's a little bit distancing and all this kind of stuff, but not really. So the crowd's articulated, it's positive. None of the paintings I talked about today, I think, are positive. It's a kind of joyous and buoyant image. And also there's an immersion within the group. There's not, as you point out, you rightly point out, there's a lot of distancing in both Coffee Line and Fairy Slip Winter. He's a long way from those groups. And that plays into the kind of class-based reading you're pushing me to say more about, and this disidentification and fear of that's happening there. But thank you very much for your comments.
Yeah, thank you again. Some things that I've been struggling to think about too. There's an anecdotal way to that might be to think to the question about that sense of what Sloan should be doing, or how he's understanding making studio new paintings at that time. When he moves into that the Greenwich Village studio, there's an incident that he records in the diary when he finds that some workmen in the building have made a hole in his studio wall so they could peep in. And he thinks that, and he writes in the diary, this is because he thinks that they've assumed that he'll be working with models and painting from the nude. That's what artists would do, and he's sort of quite happy to say, oh, there's none of that about me, I'm not involved in any of that. And then literally a couple of weeks later, he starts making these paintings, and I think there is that sense of, this is something I should be doing at some level. I think that that's true, that, that sense of, he's got his studio now, well, what do? I've got, he has access to a kind of natural light that he's not had before. So I think that, wanting, well, why do you need natural light? It's this kind of painting rather than painting from memory. So I think there is almost a going through the motions there. I think that, I think that Henry's investment in figure emotion is more complicated than simply that idea of kind of performance, which I think Kimberly Orcutt and others describe it as a sense of wanting to kind of meet the European avant-garde on their own terms. But there is still that sense as well. I think that in Carol Duncan's classic essay about European nude painting for this period, the idea of the female body as that site on which avant-garde artists displayed their mastery and enacted a kind of power relationship, I think that is present there. I think that, to me, the awkwardness and the artifice of the paintings of Catherine Wenzel and others is what makes them striking. And I think Bellows does this a little as well in the nude girl Miss Leslie Hall, where she's doing up a shoe, getting dressed or undressed. Is that how do you, if you're committed to an idea of realist painting that wants to acknowledge the situation, to not to fantasize or to create some false version of the situation, well, then you have to paint and acknowledge the artifice, the uncomfortableness, the power dynamics of the relationship. It is awkward and uncomfortable to be doing this, at least at first. And I think Sloan, I mean, this is giving him a lot of credit, but being nice to Sloan, but those paintings almost recognise his own failing, or his own, that this is a limitation, this is something he's got to get better at. That this time, John Butler Yeats is chastising him for not being able to paint ankles, right? Yeats is not going to ever make it, he can't paint ankles. So he's got to kind of work at this a little bit as well, perhaps. But I think the other kinds of questions there that I mean, well, Henry and Sloan do, and Sloan kind of to a point of repetition to exhaustion paints female nude subjects. So that teaching and that philosophy encourages other approaches too. So Bellows in particular seeks out and paints male nudes. He paints Bellows makes a painting of a nude painting of Hopper in 1905, and we would assume that in the kind of art student practice that have been reciprocated, he seeks out other instances too. And I think Bellows wants to think about a kind of an expression of his own body through those paintings, whereas Sloane's are for sure about painting the other in some sense. And I think that connects to lots of the complexity around Sloane's feeling for working class people, that there's on the one hand that fascination, that sort of idea of wanting to change and a better society, but also there's simply a kind of interest or fascination in that. When he first starts talking to John Mr. Barrell about socialism, he's sort of, well, won't this eradicate some of that interesting otherness and difference and picturesqueness that I'm keen to see? And so maybe there's an equivalence there. And I guess the last thing I'd say is that the painting of Dolly in the bath seems to operate in a continuum with drawing of Dolly in the bath seems to operate in a continuum with paintings of her sewing or doing other kinds of housework around the home, or even speaking out in the streets. And I think that there's that disconnection between how Sloan sees Dolly and how he understands women more broadly at this time, that kind of disconnect between, as we know in our contemporary moment, you can be progressive and in all kinds of ways regressive on this issue, that you can be a suffrage, you can support suffragism, but also have an othering or damaging relationship with women on a personal level. And I think that that's some of what we're seeing in Sloane's art too.
So, are there any questions from any questions from the audience for our speakers?
John, would you comment on the series of nudes that Sloan created starting in the 1920s with those strange green and red curved hatching lines?
trying to look at that. They need only one thing again.
No. I think that they're interesting from or that they illuminate these earlier works through their difference. You know, that I think clearly you can understand them within the sort of discourse of just of art, in which he's kind of, and I think there's a moment where Sloan looks back at one of these, the examples that I'm talking about, and see, you know, this is how wrong I was getting my approach to painting. I'd struggle to say more other than that sense that all of what we're getting in, or he's trying for, this sense of a kind of fleshiness and contingency is emphasised or highlighted by its absence in those later works. I mean, I mentioned in Linda Leeds' classic book on the female nude, and that sense that she has of the ideal form as being impenetrable or denying the porousness of the body, that idea of the hermetically sealed body, and I think that's imposed or implied in so many of the kind of academic nude painting. And I mean, Sloan's nudes of that period become academic in a sense. I think that they are, you know, not in every instance, and maybe there's scope to say more about certainly the ones in which he tries to work that mode of painting into everyday scenes, women coming down the stairs, or it's a particularly interesting etching nude at the etching table, which it's a kind of eroticization of making etchings that's kind of complicated to think through, but yeah, that's where we might get to. Sorry, that's not possible.
So I have a question for Margarita. I enjoyed your talk. Is there any indication that the two men at the other table are gay or queer, as was the term was used in the period? And you know, there's the red tie and the blonde, and those are signals for the 30s. Maybe it doesn't apply as early. I'm not clear. But that kind of wondering about that couple, if they're a couple, if maybe there's a way in which and you may have said this in your paper and it flew past me, so apologies. That happens when I listen to papers, so it flows by. But it struck me that maybe there's a way of thinking about the Chinese restaurant as a place in which other kinds of otherness, whether that be of prostitution or, you know, non-bourgeois people, congregate.
Yes.
And I assume it's cheaper and it's not a fancy place, but that there's something to say about that. There's various forms of, like, we'll call it non-normative white people hanging out in Chinese restaurants.
Yeah. Rebecca has certainly gestured to this, but Chinese restaurants really developed a reputation for immorality around the turn of the 20th century. So they were places where prostitutes were known to solicit customers, and that's certainly the kind of dynamic that's taking place between the central figure and presumably the figure on the left. I hadn't thought about the two figures on the right as a kind of couple. I had thought about them in terms of immigration, because during this period, the Chinese restaurants uptown, particularly in the Tenderloin, based on period accounts that I've read, were known to have attracted immigrants, primarily Jewish immigrants, and also African Americans. Regardless, I think that's also where the question of geography comes into play, because regardless of whether they were in Chinatown or uptown, they were conceived of as very immoral spaces. And that's just an interesting distinction to think about in terms of fleshing out the different spaces. But I hadn't thought about the couple, and that's a very good point.
Hi, my question is for Margarita. I was struck by the Theodore Wolf's painting that you showed, and it made me think of San Francisco and Anthony Lee's book on Picture Chinatown, and I was just curious about sort of geography and how you think about the differences between those geographic spaces, that is, the two cities, and and those sort of different contexts, or if you see them as different, or sort of the situation in San Francisco as a sort of slightly earlier Chinatown, and its own sort of restaurant spaces and so on.
You mentioned that, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, the Theodore Wars painting?
Right, as I understand it, Wars, if I remember correctly, was cut his teeth in San Francisco and made a career there.
Yeah, definitely. So I've been thinking a lot about Anthony Lee's work in general on Chinatown. And I haven't done too much research on the Wars painting, but something that's interesting about that is that it's an all-Chinese family eating at a restaurant. It still features that sort of elaborate decor, the gilded interiors that Rebecca pointed to earlier. And Anthony Lee's work has been really foundational in terms of also thinking about discourses of the picturesque, and also the sort of motivations that people had in terms of visiting Chinatown. I tried to sort of apply this model in terms of San Francisco and thinking about New York, but there did seem to be certain differences, I think, between the two cities, particularly because New York, by the 1880s, many Chinese immigrants are coming. From the West, there's this sort of fresh demographic infusion of Chinese immigrants prior to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. But I hadn't thought as much about the Wars painting that you're speaking to, but just thinking about Anthony Lee's work on the picturesque and thinking about photography has also been really interesting, because what I've found is that the photographs of New York City and of Chinatown actually are absent and void of people, whereas, of course, Anthony Lee is focusing on all of the Chinese immigrants that are pictured, often against their own will in those photographs. So just thinking about the two cities is something I need to do a little bit more on, but it's an interesting question. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for these fascinating papers this morning. I had a question for James. So I think, as anyone who's waited for a mega or Volt bus knows, there's a difference between a crowd and a line, and I was wondering how you see that playing out in the works that you discussed today, maybe pictorially, or I'd be curious to hear about crowd psychology too.
Yeah, I actually push against that, and I'd say that I agree with I'm not arguing with your experience of waiting for Megabus, because I have the same experience, but I think that, and I know this from my research, there's a very particular iconography that's being mobilized, and it's the same iconography that I think Crane's using, and it is a crowd, that's the term, it's pervasive, and so, expanding a little bit on this kind of elastic and frankly sort of yucky discourse that's anti-immigrant, anti-government, anti-democracy, anti-itself. I mean, it's kind of yucky and proto-totalitarian. And in fact, I'll add Hannah Arendt in The Origins of Totalitarianism, which was published in 1950, after the second, right around 1950. She makes great use of crowd psychology and the trend, the interest in it around this turn of the century as this sort of proto-fascist moment. She uses that in telling her story and the development of Stalinism and Nazism, but that's kind of an aside. So that the crowd line distinction, I don't think holds visually. And then I think conceptually what's both fascinating and annoying about this moment, with this focus on crowd psychology, it is everything and nothing. And so the distinction you're trying to impose on it, which is completely reasonable, is the sort of thing that it would sort of suck up like jelly and not want to acknowledge. It's not unlike certain kinds of extremely contemporary discourses we're being subject to today, like at this moment, like yesterday too, tomorrow, of sort of everything and nothing and self-contradiction. And it's kind of the sort of blackness and lack of differentiation is this pervasive metaphor supposed to cross it. But thank you for allowing me to kind of spell out what I was saying with a little more specificity.
Very interesting, thank you.
How's it?
Thank you all for these talks. My question's for John. And I really enjoyed thinking about these news, which I haven't seen a lot of for the first time this morning. And I'm trying to put my finger on what feels different about the realism of Ashcan nudes than other realist nudes like Manet or Degas. And something does feel different to me about them. And I don't know if it's kind of reportorial nature of their work or what exactly is feeling different than Manet's Olympia to the reclining nude of the 14-year-old model, for instance, which, similar pose. And one thing that struck me is that maybe Bella's and Sloan's paintings seem a little less aestheticized. They seem more focused on their subject and their interiority, and that's one possibility. But I also was really interested in the fact that they're named models in the title rather than often an anonymous, nude study or nude figure. So I wondered if you had thoughts on that.
Sure, thank you for the question. I can't answer this by talking about Bellows because, the way I came to this was not, I think, an interesting way I think about this subject is that it would never in my life have occurred to me to write about John Sloan and George Bellows' nudes studio painting at all. I don't think that that's the reason that I came to write about the Ashcan school, and I don't think it's the reason that many of us did. We encounter through these painters through one form or another a kind of social history of art, as everyone else did here. And the university that I work at, the museum gallery associated with it, purchased the George Bellows nude girl, nude Miss Bentham in 1906, and suddenly I was like, okay, got to do something with this, and trying to then find the language and to move between thinking about how I had thought about the Ashcan school and these artists and how I could find a way to talk about these figures. And it's Bellows that I've worked on the most, and I think that idea of Helen Appleton Reed, who was a terrible influence on the scholarship of this group in many, many ways, but that phrase embodiment, Bellows embodies Henry's teaching, I think is fascinating. That if you read the art spirit again and again, this idea of putting yourself in the position of the other, whether we think Henry carries that out or not, but that notion, feel the pull of the muscles, take the form of the sitter. I think that Bellows is someone, a non-natural athlete who trains himself to be good at baseball and basketball, who knows what it feels like to be seen and observed doing things, to have, as the wider work on Bellows, I talk about self-portrait, self-referential drawings of athletes in locker rooms, that he's in that world and he can put himself in that position. And I think through Bellows' painting we get a sense of a kind of reciprocity with sitters, an attempt to kind of, it becomes quite autobiographical in ways. Both male and female nudes, I think, convey something of a sense of Bellows' own physicality. So Miss Bentham's awkwardness is Bellows' own awkwardness. If you read accounts of Bellows' physicality, always on the one hand the athlete, but off the court, very awkward. There's a great Peggy Bacon cartoon of Bellows as a teacher in 1918 where it looms up above the women who he's teaching at the Art Students' League, but in this kind of very awkward position. And I think that, again, it's that kind of connection. He's acknowledging his own presence both in the room and in the bodies that he's painting. And I think that that's, to me, that sense of an attempt to break down that notion of otherness that seems so implicit in that act of making a nude study, and especially of a male artist painting often working class women. That I don't think that they get to it all the time. I think it's quite difficult to achieve or to even conceive of, but I think when these paintings are most interesting, they at least gesture towards that possibility, and I think that that's something that, as kind of replicating the difference between the ways in which Manet as an aristocratic observer of the crowd as against, Sloan as a kind of pavement level observer, and that's perhaps that sense of where difference from Impressionist painting might lie.
Thank you so much. I want to go back to a question about the poppy line. One thing that I find really interesting about that painting and my experience with it is that it's very hard to read that painting. It kind of goes back to the way you started your talk, and that it's not very legible, especially when someone who's not terribly familiar with New York or not terribly familiar with Sloan and or his context. It takes a lot of decoding, a lot of close looking And I think the Whistler sort of proto-abstraction kind of idea is one way to think about it. But is he hiding something? Is he making a strong effort, do you think, to obscure his subject for some reason here, whereas so many of his other images are readily more legible when it comes to a crowd or what you're looking at, because it can take a long time to, even as a knowledgeable viewer, to see what to understand what he's presenting you.
So just to make sure I understand the question, it's to what ends does obscurity work in this painting? So I see those on a couple of levels, some of which you've already pointed out, but there's this kind of Whistlerian nocturne, but it's sort of turned on its head. Now I'm probably in the minority on this. I think there are ways of reading Whistlerian nocturnes as referencing things like the atmospheric pollution of London, or the fact that the town was open sewer for much of the 19th century. So there's a kind of dialectical tension that's layered on Whistler already, but that's kind of neither here nor there. So there's the kind of Whistlerian nocturne nod, so that's one kind of aspect of obscurity. There's the desire, I think, to sort of, one might read it, I think one might also read the dissolution of the buildings as a kind of, I don't know, way of bringing these structures, actually no, strike that, I don't want to say that. There's the Whistlerian nocturne part, and then there's the crowd part. We'll just keep it those two things. There's other places I could go with that. They seem incompatible since the nocturne is not seen as political. So I think that's a kind of interesting move. And I can't really, I mean, there may be textual evidence for it, but I think there's plenty of visual evidence that that's what he's doing. And then as for the crowd and the line rather, and its obscurity, that's a relatively unusual motif in Sloan's work. Other than Fairy Slip Winter, those are the kind of two examples that seem the most stable to me. And again, I think that's him coming directly referencing or thinking about this very pervasive metaphor of human beings as sort of smushed together in this kind of single entity, lacking differentiation, as a kind of nightmarish version of modernity. If you have other ideas on what obscurity is all about in painting, please share them with me, because I've looked at it a lot. I'm kind of running dry.
Do I have to come in on that briefly? I was struck by that sense that lines for people waiting for coffee or handouts and bread become indexical. That the longer the line, the greater the sense of poverty and deprivation in the area. That in the 1930s graphic art, Reginald Marsh or others depictions of red lines, there's a kind of a real emphasis on counting and a kind of statistical reckoning with who's in the line. And that sense of a blurred or impressionistic line sort of takes that discourse away, so that the kind of accountable line would be a more overtly political one, I guess, would be a way of thinking about that.
Thank you all. This has been great this morning. I just wanted to continue on the story of the coffee line, because the thing about that picture that I noticed, and I've got a vested interest that I'm about to reveal, is that looking at that picture, the orientation of it is the line, but it's also Madison Square, and the highlight at the center of the picture and where he's taking his angle is the Tower of Madison Square Garden, which is the sculpture of Diana. So we have another naked lady. But anyway, but she is like the quintessential Gilded Age, nude. And so to me, you're bringing out the hotel room with its red curtain as an emblem of a kind of comfortable world, safe from the line. It's actually Madison Square Garden that is the opposition to the line, because that is a pleasure dome. I mean, it's the world's first entertainment center. You know, it's got 3 theaters, a circus, restaurants, etc. Immediately below Diana. And so it's a playground of Stanford White and, you know, ladies on swings and so forth, that is really the opposite. And that's not a very old building in 1904. In other words, that tower went up in, she went up at 10 years earlier. So it really, visually it's a focus, it's kind of comments on the previous remark, and it's very obscure. You have to know where you are and what you're looking at to know what that is. But it is very powerful for a New Yorker.
Yeah.
Margarita?
Was there any questions or a comment, I think, to this from Margarita? There's a quote I used from, I think it was from Sloan's diary, it could have been from a letter, where he says, I never went slumming it for subject matter. And listening to the talk was interesting because, of course, that word, I didn't realise how loaded it was, this phrase, slumming it. But I think I'm really interested in what you think. I can't imagine Shin ever saying anything like that. And I'm interested in how much overlap you think there is there in terms of this discussion of racial interest and racial concern, representation and otherness. Now, I do think, James had an interesting point earlier about there's other types of arguments going on in that restaurant. But in terms of racial commentary, they seem to be quite different to me, and I'm just curious what you think about that. I think that, as I said, that quote is quite interesting in relation to what you said this morning.
Can you tell me the quote again, because I missed it
You
from
said,
the beginning?
I never went slumming it for subject matter. And you were talking about these excursion tours literally being called slumming tours. And when I used the quote before, obviously I knew what he meant, but I didn't realise how loaded that word was until I heard what you were saying.
And who used that term? I'm sorry, I missed it.
That's Sloan.
Oh, Sloan.
Sloan said, sorry, I'm shouting. No good with mine. Sloan said, yeah, I never went slumming.
Really?
Slumming, yeah. And I can't remember if it's from his diary or from a letter, but I can give you the reference if I can. My memory stick.
No, that's really interesting because I was not aware of that.
But yeah, he literally says, I never went slumming it for subject matter. And as I said, I didn't realise how loaded that word was.
Right, and I think that Sloan might have imagined that he was not, I think he was interested in investigating all areas of the city. And we first know that he went to Chinatown in 1906, so I think he, whether or not that was his actual intention, I think that he was interested in the sort of spectatorial and sensory culture of Chinatown and other neighborhoods in the city. And it's an interesting sort of use of terminology because in 1906 he also stated that he thought that Chinatown was a bit too picturesque for his purposes. And he said, and I quote, details of life with the Chinaman of secondary interest would be good. So I think sort of untangling his motivations in terms of Chinese immigrants has also been another factor. It's been another sort of obstacle for me in terms of thinking about what his actual attitudes towards Chinese immigrants were. And again, I think this whole point about slumming it to Chinatown, he was actually less interested in Chinatown. He preferred to eat uptown. But there, perhaps he might not have encountered Chinese immigrants. I just don't know. But I think that Shin went downtown with that express purpose of capturing that Chinese restaurant interior. And I should also note, since you mentioned it, and I was talking about the absence of the Chinese immigrant in the painting, that that absence is countered by this entire body of puzzles that Sloan created from 1900 to 1910 for the Philadelphia Press. And in particular, he created these word puzzles from 1903 to 1910 that feature Chinese immigrants and Chinese laundries. So that has been another really interesting point for me, thinking about the stereotyped place of the restaurant versus the stereotyped place of the Chinese laundry. Two different media, but again, from the same period, and thinking about how he's sort of negotiating and thinking about this issue of racial otherness. But I'd love to see that quote because I haven't seen it. Thank you.